Margaret Elise Calloway had run the Copper Cup Diner on Birchwood Avenue in Asheville, North Carolina, for 22 years. It was not the kind of place that made it into travel magazines or showed up on food influencer feeds. The floors were original hardwood, scuffed and worn, and the booths along the east wall were upholstered in a faded burgundy that had seen better decades. But the coffee was exceptional, poured from a pot that never seemed to fully empty, and the pie, specifically the brown butter pecan pie that Margaret baked fresh every Thursday, was the kind of thing people drove across the county for without ever telling anyone where they were going, as if they were afraid the secret might slip out. Margaret opened every morning at 6:30. Not 6:28, not 6:32. 6:30 exactly. She believed there was a kind of promise embedded in consistency, that showing up on time every day was a form of love she could offer without ever having to explain it. The regulars understood. They were there when the door turned, already pulling off their coats, already nodding hello. There was one booth in the back left corner, half hidden behind the old wooden pillar that held up the ceiling and drove her contractor husband Daniel absolutely crazy every time he visited. That booth caught the morning light just right between 8 and 9 o'clock, and over the years Margaret had come to think of it as belonging to whoever needed it most on any given day. She never announced this. She never held it with a sign. It simply remained unheld. And somehow, the regulars understood that too. On a cold Wednesday in February, a man named Clifford Baines began coming in. He was in his mid-70s, maybe older, with white hair that swept back from a weathered forehead and hands that shook slightly when he reached for his mug. He wore the same canvas jacket almost every time, dark green, faded at the elbows, with a small embroidered patch on the chest that Margaret could never quite read from across the room. He always arrived at 7:15, always sat in the back left corner booth, and always ordered the same thing, black coffee and 2 eggs over easy with wheat toast. He never said much. But he never seemed unhappy, either. He had a quality Margaret associated with men who had lived a great deal and arrived somewhere quiet on the other side of it, not sad, exactly. Just settled. Like a river that had long since found its course and stopped rushing. She started having his order nearly ready before he even sat down. She wasn't sure when that began. It just did. One Wednesday in early March, a woman swept into the Copper Cup like weather, arriving ahead of schedule. She was perhaps 40, polished in the particular way that suggested she was accustomed to rooms adjusting to her presence rather than the other way around. Her name, Margaret would later learn, was Priscilla. She had driven in from Charlotte for a weekend retreat in the mountains and had stopped in Asheville to meet with a local real estate developer over brunch, and her driver had made a wrong turn and deposited her here instead of at the upscale farm-to-table place on the other side of downtown. Priscilla stood in the doorway of the Copper Cup and looked around the way people sometimes look at airports in cities they find beneath them. She said to the young man who had apparently accompanied her as some kind of assistant, "Is this actually the recommendation? This place looks like it runs on nostalgia and low expectations." She sat anyway, because she was already late and hungry, and because Margaret had appeared from behind the counter and smiled at her in such an effortlessly genuine way that it would have been rude to leave immediately. Priscilla ordered a black coffee and an egg white omelette, which the Copper Cup did not make. Margaret gently suggested a vegetable scramble, which Priscilla accepted with visible reluctance. She complained that the mug was too heavy. She complained that the window let in a draft. She glanced at Clifford sitting in the back left booth and made a comment to her assistant about how some places attracted a certain kind of clientele that told you everything you needed to know. Margaret said nothing. She brought Priscilla's scramble out hot and plated beautifully, with a small ramekin of salsa verde on the side that nobody had asked for but that Priscilla quietly ate every drop of. When the check came, Priscilla left the exact amount and nothing more, stood without pushing in her chair, and pulled out her phone as she walked to the door. By the time she reached her car, the review was already posted. 2 stars. Quaint if you have no standards. Coffee was fine, atmosphere was tired, staff seemed to have no idea they're 2 decades behind. Would not recommend unless you enjoy eating in a museum exhibit about diners that peaked in 1987. Margaret saw it that afternoon when her daughter sent her a screenshot with a sad face emoji. She read it once, set her phone face down on the counter, and went back to refilling the coffee pot. Clifford came in the following Wednesday as always. He was wearing the green jacket. He looked, if anything, a little more tired than usual, but he smiled when he saw Margaret already moving toward the coffee pot, and that small thing, that tiny unhurried smile, straightened something in her chest that she hadn't realized had been bent. She slid his mug across. He wrapped both hands around it the way people do when they're warming something deeper than their palms. "Cold one out there today," she said. "Always is this time of year," he said. "But it gets warmer. Always does." She left him to his eggs and his light and his quiet, the way she always did. 6 weeks later, a woman named Dana Okafor walked into the Copper Cup on a Tuesday afternoon. She introduced herself to Margaret as a features writer for the Asheville Citizen-Times and said she was working on a piece about the small businesses that had quietly become woven into the fabric of the city's identity, the places that weren't trendy but were true, the ones that people defended fiercely to outsiders even if they'd never left a formal review. She asked Margaret if she'd be willing to talk on record. Margaret made her a cup of coffee and a slice of the pecan pie and said she'd think about it. As Dana settled in with her notebook, she glanced toward the back left booth. Clifford was there, as he was every Wednesday now. He was reading a paperback, his reading glasses low on his nose, his coffee at his elbow. Dana looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Margaret with a different expression entirely. "Is that Clifford Baines?" she said quietly. Margaret looked up. "That's what his card says when he pays." "You know him?" Dana set down her pen. "He was the restaurant critic for the Southern Food Review for 34 years, she said. "He retired about 3 years ago. He's essentially the reason half the restaurants in this region exist. One write-up from Clifford Baines could change a place's trajectory entirely. He was the gold standard." Margaret was quiet for a moment. She looked at Clifford in his green jacket with his paperback and his coffee. She thought about the way he always said thank you when she refilled his mug. She thought about the 2 eggs over easy, the wheat toast, always finished clean. "He's never said a word to me about any of that," she said. Dana smiled slowly. "He wouldn't." The profile ran 6 weeks later. It was not a short piece. The profile ran 6 weeks later. It was not a short piece. Dana had gone deep, into the history of the Copper Cup, into Margaret's 22 years on Birchwood Avenue, into the way the diner had quietly sustained the neighborhood through 2 recessions and a pandemic and the slow creeping gentrification that had changed the character of nearly every block around it. She interviewed regulars, she spoke to Margaret's husband Daniel about the pillar he'd wanted to remove for 15 years and that Margaret had always refused to touch. And she included, near the end, a small sidebar, a final restaurant note, as it were, from Clifford Baines himself, who Dana had met for coffee the week before and who had agreed to offer one last professional observation. He wrote 3 sentences. He wrote that the Copper Cup was the finest example he had encountered in 34 years of a restaurant that understood its purpose. He wrote that Margaret Calloway had achieved something most restaurateurs spend entire careers chasing and never find, a room that feels like it already knows you. He wrote that the brown butter pecan pie was, without qualification, the best thing he had eaten in the state of North Carolina. By the Sunday the piece ran, there was a line outside the Copper Cup that stretched past the bookstore and around the corner onto Hazel Mill Road. People drove from Hendersonville, from Brevard, from Charlotte. They waited 45 minutes in the cold without complaint, which is not something Asheville people do lightly. Somewhere in that line, though Margaret would never know it, was Priscilla. She waited 45 minutes. She got a booth by the window on the east side, not the back left corner. She ordered a black coffee and looked at the menu for a long time. She ordered the vegetable scramble and a slice of the pecan pie. She sat by herself for a while after she finished eating. She left a $20 on a $14 check. She took down the 2-star review that afternoon and replaced it with nothing. Not a correction. Not an apology. Just silence, which was perhaps the most honest thing she'd offered the whole time. And Clifford came in the following Wednesday at 7:15, ordered his black coffee and 2 eggs over easy with wheat toast, and sat in the back left booth where the morning light found him perfectly between 8 and 9. Margaret had his order nearly ready before he sat down. He wrapped both hands around his mug. He smiled. Nothing about that morning was different, except that now Margaret understood a little more clearly what she had already known, that the quiet ones, the unhurried ones, the ones who arrive simply and ask for nothing extraordinary, they are often carrying something enormous. They have simply learned, over a long and full life, not to wear it on their sleeve.